In a splintered wooden box, 2 German shepherd pups clung to one another, their small bodies rigid with ice, each breath a fading whisper, lost with every swirl of blinding snow. They were a secret meant to perish. But miles down that same desolate road, a different kind of ghost was drifting, a Navy SEAL haunted by the specter of war, driving into oblivion with a cargo of memories he could never outrun. Everyone said he was beyond saving anything, least of all himself. But as his headlights cut through the storm to find 2 tiny forms trembling, he felt a flicker of what it meant to fight for a life. And what unfolded next is a testament to the belief that even in the deepest winter of the soul, miracles find their way to the broken. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your corner of the world in the comments. The sky over northern Maine was a canvas of pale, unforgiving gray, stretched taut over a silent world of pines buried deep in snow. The very air carried the brutal stillness that settles after a blizzard's fury when the howling ceases, and all that's left is a silence so profound it could suffocate a man's thoughts. A shroud of snow clung to every branch, every wire clinging to the world as the light began to fail, feeling less like day and more like a final dusk. The road was a ghost beneath the powder, yet the old Ford pickup pressed on its tires, protesting the frozen ground. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Cole, his gaze locked on the thin, gray ribbon that disappeared into the woods. At 37, his face was a map of hardship, unshaven, the corners of his eyes etched with the lines of sleepless nights. A jagged scar, a relic of another life, traced from his left temple toward his jaw, partially concealed by a sparse beard. The faded patch of a trident, the hallowed mark of the Navy SEALs, remained, stitched to his jacket sleeve, its fabric worn thin by more than time, by regret. Ethan's shoulders were wide, his posture an unyielding line years removed from the battlefield. But that soldier's discipline had hardened into a kind of armor not against bullets, but against the ghosts of his memory. He drove on through the blinding white void radio silent. The only sounds were the drone of the engine and the weary groan of metal against the bitter cold. He was heading back to a place he could never call home, a cabin his father had left him, a hard man who, 2 lessons were burned into him: never show weakness, never expect peace. The old man died 3 months ago, but the void he left behind wasn't grief, it was just emptiness. Ethan had stood dry-eyed at the funeral. He hadn't uttered more than a few words. He just kept moving because standing still meant letting the ghosts finally catch him. The truck groaned over the crest of a hill, its high beams slicing through the blizzard's haze. And that's when he saw it, a dark shape by the roadside, half swallowed by a snowdrift. Too uniform for a log, too square for a stone, instinct took over. His boot found the brake, and the truck skidded, fishtailing on the ice before shuddering to a halt. For a long moment he just sat there, wipers fighting a losing battle against the frost. Every rational part of him screamed to keep driving, but that other instinct, the one that had kept him alive, in the sand and the mud, it gave a single quiet order: asterisk, check it. He shoved the door open, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. His own breath plumed in the air as he pushed through the deep snow. The wind rose again, and with it came a sound so faint it was almost nothing. Not the wind, but not quite a cry. It was a wooden crate, its timbers ancient, its nails bleeding rust. One side was split open. Ethan knelt in the snow, brushing away the snow. Inside were 2 German shepherd pups, barely 8 or 9 weeks old, curled into one another like fragments of a broken promise. Their fur, matted with ice and filth, barely hid the ribs visible through thin black and tan coats. One's nose twitched faintly. The other was a statue of ice. Dear God, Ethan breathed the words, vanishing in the frigid air. He reached a gloved hand, then hesitated. Their forms trembled, too frail for this world. Someone had just left them here to fade away. He scanned the silent, watching forest. Boot prints a ghost of a trail already being erased by the snow. Whoever did this was long gone, long enough to forget. He clenched his jaw. Not my war, he told himself, the lie tasting like ash. He turned back to the truck. The wind shrieked through the pines, a spray of ice against his face. Detachment was a reflex now. Assess the damage, accept the loss, and move on. It's how he made it out of the desert, how he survived the quiet war of coming home. Reaching the truck, he paused. Through the glass, he could still see the crate, a dark wound on the white landscape. The image was seared into him. Two small souls huddled together, disappearing under the same sky that haunted his waking dreams. His fingers drummed a frantic rhythm on the wheel. He stared down at the scar on his hand, a map of the day his world ended, the day he lost his entire team. He heard the radio's death rattle the blast, the deafening silence that followed. He felt the weight of what was left of his brother, his blood a warm stain spreading across his uniform. The guilt had been frozen in him since. He gritted his teeth, forcing his gaze away. "Not my fight," he repeated, the engine roaring to life like a protest. The tires spun, screaming on the ice. He pushed the gear into drive. But as he started to pull away, a ghost in the rearview mirror made him look back. A flicker of movement, almost nothing. One of the puppies had raised its head, weakly pulling its fragile body over the other, a final desperate shield. Its eyes were dark and hollow, but a fire still burned in them. Defiance, instinct, maybe even love. Ethan's throat went tight. That gesture, the stronger protecting the weaker, hit him like a shot to the heart. He'd seen that before in the sand when his teammate became a shield for the rest of them, just seconds before the flash. He slammed the brakes. The truck skidded. For a long moment there was only silence and his own ragged breath. His pulse thundered in his ears. The wind howled outside, a tormented sound. He let out a single raw curse under his breath. Damn it. He shoved the door open and stepped back into the blizzard. The cold gnawed at his face as he trudged back to the crate. The puppies were still. This time they were beyond shivering. Ethan knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and carefully scooped them up. They were as light as fallen leaves, their fur stiff with the encroaching frost. One let out a faint cry against his chest. The other was limp, but life's faintest whisper remained. "Hang on," he murmured, tucking them deep inside his jacket. "You're not checking out today." He rushed back to the truck, his boots crunching a desperate rhythm in the snow. Inside, he set them on the seat and blasted the heater to its max. The vents hissed, bathing the cab in life-giving air, sound that made his throat ache. For what felt like an eternity, he just sat staring at two fragile lives shivering, bathed in the dashboard's blood-red glow. His hands shook on the wheel, a familiar tremor from when the fight would fade, and the quiet rushed in. He finally spoke, his voice a broken whisper. "All right," he breathed out. "You win." Tut-thiu. Falling snow glimmered in the headlights, every single flake a ghost of a falling star. He eased the truck back on the road, aimed for his cabin in the woods, unaware that the faint warmth he felt against his chest was the first crack in the ice that had frozen him solid for years. As he drove, the storm began to break, leaving the world a glassy white canvas reflecting a pale light across his face. The two pups pressed in closer, their breaths syncing with the engine's low hum. Ethan let out a long, shaky breath, his gaze drifting to the night sky. "Damn it," he whispered again. But under the curse was something fragile, something that felt dangerously like hope. He shifted the headlights, slicing a path through the trees, making the snow glitter like shattered glass. It wasn't much, just two lives pulled from a frozen highway. But for a man like Ethan Cole, it was the first step onto a path he couldn't yet dare to name. The storm passed, leaving the whole world shining. The light from the snow reflected softly on his face, catching the pale blue of his eyes, as if a long dead ember was starting to flicker back to life. Dawn broke gray and brittle over the forest. The storm had left behind a quiet so profound the very trees seemed to hold their breath. In his small cabin, the stove offered a faint glow, its fire just a handful of dying embers. Ethan Cole sat on the floor beside it, his broad shoulders slumped forward under an invisible weight. A blanket was wrapped around the two small shepherd pups resting in his lap. Their fur was still damp, their small frames trembling from a cold the fire couldn't touch. The stronger of the two, its coat darker, twitched its nose in sharp, nervous bursts, its head lifted just enough to watch him with wide eyes. The weaker one lay still except for the shallow breaths that clouded his sleeve. He'd managed to get a few drops of warm water in them with a syringe cap, but it was far from enough. The smaller one's heart was erratic, fading like a broken radio signal in a bad storm. He glanced at the wall clock. It had stopped dead sometime in the night. A sliver of daylight forced its way through a crack in the window, illuminating the smoke from the embers. He knew this feeling, watching a life just slip away while you could do nothing. He wouldn't watch that happen again. Ethan's jaw clenched. He cursed under his breath and grabbed his jacket, wrapping the pups inside his coat, tucking them against the warmth of his chest, hoping it would give them a fighting chance. He then stepped out into the biting cold. The snow was deep, nearly to his knees, as he pushed his way toward the truck. Each step was a battle, his breath pluming in the air, his boots breaking through the frozen crust. The cabin vanished behind him as he fired up the engine and turned onto the road to Mill Creek, a town he hadn't dared to enter since his father's funeral. The drive was painfully slow. The world was bleached white. The trees stood like ghosts against the dawn, and the failing heater could only clear small circles through the ice. Ice spider-webbed the glass. Ethan's eyes darted to his coat, searching for the faintest sign. A flutter of life, a ghost of a breath. "Stay with me," he rasped. "Just hold on a little longer." It took what felt like an eternity to reach the town. The sign for Mill Creek sagged beneath a blanket of snow. The streets were dead silent. A few lonely lights burned behind frosted panes. Ethan parked by a wooden building with its hand-painted sign, Jennings Animal Care. Inside, a wave of warmth hit him, smelling of antiseptic and cedar wood. Behind the desk stood Sarah Jennings, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair in a loose braid and soft gray eyes holding both compassion and exhaustion. She was tall, her skin pale against the cold, with a few freckles dusted across her nose. A thick wool sweater hung on her frame sleeves, pushed up to show strong forearms. Years of mending animals had forged a quiet confidence, but the lines around her eyes spoke of nights spent alone, wrestling with bills and loss. When the door chimed, she flinched. "Sorry, we're not open." Her words died, seeing the man in the doorway, snow dripping from his coat, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. He stepped forward, pulling the jacket open just enough to show the two small puppies inside. "They're freezing!" Ethan's voice was gravel, every word clipped and precise like a command. "Found them on the road, one's barely breathing." Sarah was already moving. "Bring them here." Her tone switched instantly from polite to decisive. She led him to a steel table near the back, where the light from a small heater glowed on instruments and jars of cotton. Ethan set the puppies down carefully. Sarah's hands moved fast, checking gums, pulse, body temperature. "This one's a fighter," she said, nodding toward the darker pup. "The other is hypothermic. We need to warm it slowly, or we will stop its heart." She swaddled the small one in towels, placed it under a lamp, and started a tiny IV line with practiced precision. Ethan stood beside her, rigid arms crossed. His eyes were fixed on the weak pup's chest rise faintly. "Will it make it?" She glanced at him, her expression a careful mask. If we're lucky, then softer. Sometimes luck is just another word for refusing to give up. Her words hung in the air. Ethan looked around the quiet clinic. The shelves were old but orderly, jars labeled by hand, framed photos on the wall, dogs and cats, some with families, others waiting. A photo near the door stole his gaze. A Marine in desert fatigues grinned beside Sarah. His face? It was familiar. "Your husband?" Ethan asked quietly. Sarah froze, then slowly nodded her head. "He was a corpsman. We lost him 2 years ago outside Mosul." Her voice was steady but distant, as if the wound had scarred over but never healed. "You sound like someone who's seen that same empty space before." Ethan gave no immediate answer, his gaze falling to his own rough and scarred hands. SEAL team. A different war, but the ghosts were the same. For the first time, Sarah truly looked at him, her gaze studying his face, the shape of his jaw, the faint scar near his temple. Her eyes widened with a flicker of stunned recognition. "You were there," she whispered. "My husband. He wrote about you. Said a Navy SEAL pulled him from an ambush after his vehicle was hit. He never even knew your name." Ethan's throat felt tight. "That was your husband?" She nodded slowly. "He said you saved his life." "Not enough," Ethan muttered, the old guilt clawing its way up his chest. He turned from her, staring out at the snow. "He still died." Sarah didn't answer right away. She adjusted the heat lamp, her eyes on the tiny pup beneath it. "Maybe saving someone once is all we get. Sometimes that has to be enough." They stood there in the quiet. The fire in the wood stove crackled in the corner, throwing flickering shadows against the cold metal walls. The stronger pup whimpered, pawing at Ethan's boot. He bent down, rubbing its ears, feeling the warmth seeping back into its fur. "Guess you're the fighter," he murmured. The door creaked open, and a small boy peeked in. Tommy Jennings, about 10 years old, with a mess of chestnut hair and bright green eyes, was swallowed by a coat too big for him. His cheeks were flushed from the cold. "Mom, is everything all right?" Sarah gave a weary smile. "Just some new patients, honey. Go wash. Up. I'll be in soon." Tommy's gaze fell to the puppies, his face instantly alight. "Are they ours?" "Not exactly," Sarah said softly. "They're just visiting." When the boy was gone, Ethan exhaled slowly, looking at the pup under the lamp. Its breathing had steadied just a little, the tremors slowing. Sarah touched the IV line, her fingers gentle. "He's not out of the woods, but he's fighting." "Fighting," Ethan repeated the word, an echo from his own life. "Yeah, I know what that looks like." Minutes stretched into silence. The storm outside had finally died, leaving only the soft creak of snow sliding from the roof. Sarah leaned back on the counter, the exhaustion of the night settling deep in her shoulders. "You did the right thing bringing them here," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I almost didn't." "Then maybe that's exactly why you did," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "Maybe second chances are just disguised as lost causes." He looked over at her, unsure how to respond. Faith was a language he hadn't spoken in years, but as the smaller puppy stirred, letting out a fragile whimper that pierced the silence, something fractured inside him, a tether pulling him back towards the living. Sarah leaned forward, a faint smile touching her lips. Hear that he still wants to live. Ethan turned toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Guess I'll stick around a few days, just to make sure." Outside, the snow began falling again, soft, slow flakes drifting in the pale morning light. Inside the clinic, a different kind of warmth spread from the small fire, reaching the hearts of two strangers and two tiny lives that refused to give up. The storm that had punished Mill Creek finally broke overnight, leaving the town glazed in a silent coat of frost. The morning light crept slowly over the snow-covered roofs, soft as a held breath, until it touched the broken shingles of the Jennings Animal Care Clinic. From the outside, the building itself looked worn out. The roof-sagged gutters hung heavy with icicles, and one of the front windows was fractured from the storm's weight. But inside, the air was warm, alive. The gentle rhythm of breath, a tentative bark, and Sarah Jennings's soft-spoken words wove together a fragile tapestry of life that had somehow weathered the brutal winter. Ethan Cole stood poised on a ladder against the roof, a hammer in his grip, his breath a white plume in the sharp morning air. His jacket, unzipped against the biting cold, showed a gray flannel shirt with sleeves rolled with purpose. He moved with a quiet, practiced cadence, the way soldiers do when the present is the only safe place for the mind. Muscles in his arms tensed with each swing, the pale scar along his temple, catching the morning light. Down below, Tommy Sarah's 10-year-old son shoveled snow from the clinic's entrance, his small frame moving with an eager quickness, trying to impress. "Be careful up there," Sarah called from the doorway, wisps of her auburn hair escaping a loose braid. She wore a faded green coat and wool gloves that had seen their share of hard winters. The cold had flushed her cheeks, her eyes soft yet watchful. Ethan risked a brief glance down, giving a small nod before his focus returned to his work. Inside, the two puppies were curled together in a large crate, lined with blankets tucked near the wood stove's warmth. They were healing quickly. The larger one had already begun exploring the corners of the room, sniffing with a relentless curiosity, while the smaller one remained near the fire, cautious but intensely watchful. Ethan had given them names the night before. Ranger for the bold one, with the darker muzzle and sharp, knowing eyes, and Scout for the smaller pup with lighter fur and a timid way of tilting its head before inching closer. Ranger let out a single bark, testing his new voice. Scout just yawned and burrowed into the blanket. Sarah's quiet laugh echoed from across the room. "They're getting stronger," she said. Ethan hammered the final nail into the beam and climbed down his boots, landing with a heavy thud. "They're tough," he said, brushing frost from his sleeves. "Suppose that's what it takes to make it out here." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. You sound like you know something about that." He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the woodpile next to the clinic and began to methodically stack logs. She watched him for a moment. His movements held both rigid control and an immense distance, as if every single task was a wall he was building to keep his feelings at bay. When Tommy ran inside to warm up, he stopped by the crate, crouching, low beside the pups. "Hey, Ranger. Hey, Scout," he whispered, scratching gently behind their ears. The dogs' tails thumped with instant trust. Tommy looked up at Ethan, his gaze filled with an admiration that comes easily to kids who hadn't yet learned how complicated heroes can be. "They really seem to like you," the boy said. A rare half-smile touched Ethan's face. "Guess we all just needed a place to land." By noon, the repairs were finished. Sarah brought out steaming coffee in chipped mugs and handed one to Ethan. "You didn't have to do all that," she said quietly. "I did," he replied simply. The roof was falling in. A faint smile graced Sarah's lips. "Still, it's been a long time since somebody did something around here just because they could." She paused, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "You could stay for a while. You know there's plenty more that needs fixing and I can't pay much, but maybe it would give you something to do." Ethan looked out across the snow-blanketed field, stretching beyond the clinic. "I wasn't planning to stay long," he said. But the words felt hollow in his own ears. That afternoon, as Ethan worked to replace the shattered glass, Sarah tended to the animals, mending a farm dog's paw, wrapping a cat that had stumbled in nearly frozen solid. Her movements were calm and assured her hands unwavering, her voice a gentle murmur of comfort. Ethan found his gaze drawn to her more than once, wondering how a soul so broken could still offer so much kindness to others. As evening shadows deepened, Tommy stayed close to the stove, flanked by Ranger and Scout. "My mom said you were in the Navy," the boy said abruptly, looking at Ethan. "The SEALs." Ethan stopped lowering the tool from his hand. "That's right. My dad was a Marine," Tommy stated, his voice gaining an edge. "He said the SEALs were the very best, that you guys saved people." Ethan gave a single, slow nod. "We tried." Tommy's brow furrowed. "You saved my dad once, right?" Ethan stiffened, blindsided by the question. Sarah by the sink shifted her gaze, but remained silent. "My mom told me." Tommy pressed on his voice, climbing. "She said you dragged him out after it went off, but he was gone later. Why didn't you save him again?" The question struck Ethan like a piece of shrapnel. His throat tightened, but words failed him. "It doesn't always happen that way, kid," he finally said, his voice low. "We can't save everyone." Tears of anger welled in Tommy's eyes. "You could have tried harder." He spun around and fled to his little room past the clinic, the door slamming shut behind him. The slam reverberated through the thin walls. Ethan's gaze fell to the floorboards. "He's only a boy," Sarah said gently. "He doesn't mean it." Ethan's jaw clenched. "But he's right." He placed the hammer down and walked outside before she could reply. The air had turned bitter cold as a sharp, pale moon ascended the horizon. He lit a cigarette. He had no intention of finishing, his eyes lost in the dark woods beyond the town's edge. Inside, Sarah watched over the crate, observing the sleeping puppy. Ranger moved uneasy, his ears flickering. Scout whimpered in a dream. "We all carry our ghosts, Ethan," she whispered to the quiet room. The hours bled by. The clinic fell into a deep silence. The snow returned, falling thicker now, blanketing everything in a layer of white. Sarah went to check on Tommy. His bed was empty. A cold dread filled her stomach. "Tommy!" she called, her voice tight with panic. Silence. Then Ranger let out a loud, sharp bark that jolted Scout awake. Ethan, who had been drifting by the fire, was instantly on his feet. He saw the look on Sarah's face and knew before she even spoke. "He's gone," she managed, out of breath. "He's not in his room." Ethan snatched his coat and a flashlight. "Where does he go?" "The woods," Sarah answered, her body trembling. "He goes there when he's upset." Ethan nodded, already moving toward the door. "You stay here. Leave the lights on." Ranger shot past him out into the snow, nose to the ground, tail erect. Scout whined, hesitating for a moment, then followed. The three figures vanished into the darkness. A man and his two dogs consumed by the storm's ethereal glow. Behind them, the clinic's light flickered a faint glimmer through the heavy snow, a solitary beacon of hope against the overwhelming cold and dark. The blizzard had become a solid curtain of white, erasing both sound and sight. The woods of Mill Creek rose like ghostly figures, every pine bowed by the snow's crushing weight, every gust of wind a mournful howl. Living soul, Ethan Cole fought through the drifts, his flashlight beam shaking his own breath, coming in shallow, white clouds that died in the air. Beside him, Ranger, the dark German shepherd, forged ahead, his nose to the ground, his tail a steady rudder in the storm. And behind them, Scout, smaller and lighter in his coat, struggled to keep pace, paws sinking into the powder, but he refused to be left behind. Their world was now just shadow and ice, the kind of night that erases all direction. Ethan's boots broke through the crusted layers of snow, chasing the fading line of tiny footprints. The ones that belonged to Tommy Jennings, the 10-year-old boy, who had bolted into the storm after their argument. Each print was already half gone, being buried by the fresh snowfall. "Tommy!" Ethan screamed, his voice devoured by the wind. "Tommy!" There was no answer. just the mournful cry of the blizzard, and his dog's steady panting. His pulse hammered his ribs as the wind clawed at his face, biting through the rough stubble along his jaw. But this was more than just the cold. This was the old familiar tightening in his throat, the precipice of panic before the memories break free. He pushed on, but the deeper he went, the more the trees began to bleed together. The forest sound twisted into something else, entirely something old and buried. For a terrifying second, the crunch of snow became the grinding of gravel under combat boots. The frozen air burned into a searing heat, and the wind's howl became a missile's shriek overhead. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the vision moved faster than he could fight it. His team running through sand, the radio, crackling with static, and then the explosion. The concussion hit him again, not in the desert, but right here in the woods, and he staggered, dropping to one knee. His breath tore from him, his flashlight falling into the snow. He saw faces in the shadows. The men he'd lost their voices carried on the wind. "Cole, get up," one of them yelled in his head. "The boy is still out there." He pressed his hands to his ears, but it couldn't block the sound. The forest spun around him, the trees contorting into the jagged skeletons of war-torn buildings. He couldn't breathe. His heart pounded so fast it was a blur of pain. He fell forward, his knees plunging into the snow, head bowed, his body trembling. For a moment he wanted to surrender, to let this cold take what the desert hadn't been able to claim. That's when a sudden warmth brushed against his arm. A small wet nose nudged his hand, demanding. Then a soft whine. It was Scout, the smaller of the two, his fur caked with snow, his eyes wide and desperate. The little dog pawed at Ethan's sleeve, tugging, whimpering, nipping gently at the fabric, as if to scream, "Get up!" Ranger circled close, let out a single sharp bark, a command that sliced through the fog in Ethan's head. He looked down, meeting Scout's gaze, those fragile brown eyes so full of a stubborn will to live. The trembling stopped. His breathing slowed. The desert faded away, replaced by the real biting weight of the snow. "All right," he rasped, his voice raw. "I'm here." He reached a hand out, stroking the pup's head, feeling the warmth of that tiny heartbeat. Ranger barked again, then launched forward, nose low, tail high. He had the trail. Ethan got to his feet. Shaky, but focused, his training taking hold again. The soldier's discipline resurfaced as he seized the light from the snow and followed. Its beam cut across stark white and shadow, then snagged on a flash of color. A small bright red scarf tangled in the low branches of a pine tree. Ethan ripped it free. He's close. He breathed that familiar tightness coiling in his chest, but this time it was born of resolve, not the old fear. They plunged deeper into the woods. The snow fell thicker around them, and the air grew so bitter that ice began to crystallize on Ethan's eyelashes. Ranger moved like a shadow with a singular purpose, pausing only to bark and claw at the frozen ground. Scout kept close, glancing back to ensure his handler was still right there. His legs burned from the punishing climb, but he refused to slow down. Not this time. Minutes began to bleed into what felt like hours. Then Ranger froze, standing rigid beside a fallen log. He let out a single sharp bark of urgency. Ethan stumbled toward the sound, shoving deep snow aside. His flashlight beam swept across a small form nearly buried in a drift. It was a child's body, terrifyingly still. Tommy. He fell to his knees, his hands frantically brushing snow from the boy's small face. Tommy's lips were a pale, deathly blue, his hair stiff with ice eyes closed. Ethan pressed two trembling fingers to his neck. So faint, but there it was. A pulse. The relief that crashed over him felt like a physical blow. "Got you," he choked out. "You're okay, kid." He tore off his own jacket, swaddling Tommy's small frame in its warmth. The child stirred a faint, weak whimper, escaping his throat. I'm right here, Ethan repeated, lifting him with care. His arms screamed in protest, but he held the boy close, trying to share his own warmth. Ranger stayed ahead, a guide leading them back toward the distant hazy lights of town. Scout followed at their heels, barking occasionally as if to keep Ethan on his feet. The path back became a nightmare of white and wind. 2 times Ethan stumbled, almost falling, but each time Ranger would stop turning to bark until Ethan righted himself. That dog seemed to know the path forward even when the man didn't. The snow became less hostile as they neared the tree line, the clinic's lights now flickering faintly through the haze. When they finally broke into the clearing, Sarah was already there, a lone figure standing outside with a lantern. Her green coat whipped in the wind, her auburn hair plastered to her face by snow. Her eyes grew wide the moment she saw them. "Tommy!" She screamed a raw cry as she ran toward them. Ethan placed the boy in her arms, his own breath ragged. "He's breathing. Just so cold." He managed his voice low and strained. She pressed her forehead to Tommy's, sobbing, whispering his name over and over. Ethan took a step back as pure exhaustion crashed over him. The 2 dogs immediately pressed close to his legs, Ranger ever steady and proud, and Scout trembling but alive. He rested a hand on each of their heads, feeling his own throat tighten with emotion. "Good job, boys," he whispered hoarsely. "You did it." Sarah looked up, her tears mixing with the snow on her cheeks. "You saved his life." Ethan shook his head slowly. "They did." As she rushed Tommy inside, Ethan turned to face the woods one last time. The storm's back had been broken. The wind was quiet. Snow still fell, but gently now, like dust settling after a long battle. For the first time in years, the silence that followed didn't feel like a thing to fear. It felt like grace. Morning arrived softly over Mill Creek, a pale golden ribbon threading through the laden pine boughs still heavy with fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving the whole world quiet and new. The scent of wood smoke and antiseptic filled the small clinic, a strangely human warmth against the cold. Sarah Jennings kept vigil by the narrow cot where her son lay, her palm resting gently on his forehead. The color finally returning to his cheeks was a more breathtaking sight than any sunrise she could remember. Her auburn hair was a tangled mess, her eyes raw from weeping, but a flicker of hope now lit them, the kind that only dawns when a long night of fear finally breaks. Tommy stirred a faint murmur escaping his lips. Beside him, 2 German shepherd pups were curled in a tight ball, their small chests rising and falling in perfect time with his own. Ranger, the darker one, draped a paw protectively across Tommy's small frame, while Scout, the more timid of the 2, was nestled securely beneath the boy's chin. As Tommy's eyelids fluttered, confusion gave way to the anchor of recognition. "Mom," he breathed, Sarah's voice fractured. "I'm right here, my love. You're safe now?" The boy blinked, the shattered pieces of his memory slowly coming back together. He saw the dogs, then Ethan Cole, standing like a shadow in the corner, his coat still flecked with snow, a silent guardian in the room's soft light. "You found me," Tommy whispered. Ethan gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You gave us one hell of a scare." Ranger barked once, as if in agreement, and Tommy managed a weak laugh. He reached out a trembling hand to stroke the pup's fur. "They never left me. Not even when I couldn't move." They're good soldiers," Ethan finished for him, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Sarah rose, then crossing the room to him. She took his rough, scarred hand between both of hers, a desperate, grateful gesture that needed no words. "You saved my son's life," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan slowly shook his head. "They did," he said, nodding toward Ranger and Scout. "I just followed their lead." Her fingers tightened on his. "You brought him home to me," she insisted. "That is a debt I can never repay." For a long moment, a sacred silence settled between them, a quiet born not of absence, but of a deep, unspoken understanding. Later, after Tommy had drifted back to sleep with the pups snoring at his side, Sarah began to brew coffee in a small metal pot by the hearth. She poured a cup for Ethan, the steam rising between them like a ghost. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was gentle, yet it carried a strength he recognized, the tone of a soul who had learned how to endure without asking for permission. Ethan obeyed, sinking into the chair opposite hers. The firelight danced across his face, casting his sharp jawline in amber, revealing the deep exhaustion in his eyes and the thin white scar that cut across his temple. He looked far older than his years, his features a map carved by too many haunted, sleepless nights. "You were there, weren't you?" Sarah began, her voice barely a whisper. "In Mosul, with my husband, David Jennings. He wrote about a man, just like you." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the fire, the muscles in his neck cording tightly. "He was a brave man," he said at last. "He kept his men alive longer than anyone had a right to expect." Sarah's eyes filled with unshed tears. "He told me someone dragged him clear after the convoy was hit. That this man wouldn't stop, he just kept pulling him until he was safe." Ethan's jaw locked. He swallowed hard before looking at her. "It was chaos." He set his voice a low rasp. "We thought we had made it. Then the second blast came. I can still hear it every time I close my eyes." His hand trembled as he set the coffee cup down. He was still talking. I remember that. Asking if the others were okay, I told him what they were. It was a lie. And before I could... He choked, his voice cracking. Before I could say another word, the flames just swallowed him. I tried to go back. My CO had to drag me out. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she never looked away. "You did go back," she said, her voice a near whisper. "You went back tonight for my son." Ethan shook his head, his voice raw. "I should have gone back for your husband." "There are things you can't go back and change," Sarah said, her tone suddenly firm. "Things none of us can. My husband always believed some people were meant to keep fighting so that others could finally have peace. Maybe that's what you were meant for Ethan, to carry souls home when their own legs give out." The words settled in the space between them like silent falling snow. Quiet, heavy, and true. Ethan exhaled a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "You really believe that?" he asked. "I have to," she answered softly. "Otherwise, none of this makes any sense." The fire crackled in the hearth. Ranger stretched out nearby, one ear twitching at the sound. Scout yawned, rolling onto his back, his little belly rising and falling in the gentle firelight. Ethan stared deep into the flames, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I got out of the service, I thought I was done saving people. Turns out I'd just stopped trying to save myself." Sarah offered a faint, sad smile. "Then maybe it's time you let someone else help carry you." He met her gaze, taken aback by the compassion there. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Two souls who had lost so much but refused to lose their faith in trying. Outside, the wind whispered against the window panes. The world was finally thawing. Not just the ice, but something buried much deeper. As the night wore on, Sarah laid a blanket over Tommy, who stirred, murmuring something about Ranger being his very best friend. She chuckled quietly, smoothing the hair from his forehead. When she looked up, Ethan was still by the fire, his posture exhausted but peaceful. She gestured to the sofa against the far wall. "You should probably stay. Those roads will be pure ice until morning." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right." She returned with another blanket, draping it across the back of the couch. As she was about to leave, she stopped. "Ethan?" He looked up. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of meaning. He didn't answer, just watched her walk away. Then he leaned back, listening to the soft, even breaths of the sleeping boy, the occasional huff from the dogs and the steady, low hum of the fire. Scout had snuggled into Tommy's arms, his little tail twitching in his sleep. Ranger laid at Ethan's feet, resting his heavy head against the man's worn boot. Ethan reached down, running a hand through the loyal dog's coarse fur. "You're a good soldier, Ranger," he whispered. "You too, Scout." For the first time in years, the crushing weight on his chest seemed to lift. The ghosts were still there, but their voices were distant now. The house was filled with the scent of warmth, of safety, of life. Sarah paused for a moment in the doorway, just watching the scene unfold. Her son fast asleep, the two dogs curled up beside him, and the quiet, haunted man who had carried them all out of the freezing dark. She said nothing more. Nothing needed to be said. In that little clinic beneath the whisper of the snow-laden pines, warmth had finally returned, not from the fire, but from the slow, flickering glow of hope. The days that followed were peaceful, almost deceptively so. The deep snow outside the clinic had hardened to a crisp, fragile shell, glistening beneath a fragile sun fighting through a heavy gray sky. Within the hearth whispered with a quiet crackle, and the cadence of their lives had found a soft, peaceful tempo. Ethan Cole was mending the fence out back while Sarah Jennings cared for the wounded animals brought by the villagers, a goat with a painful limp, an aged cat with frost-bitten ears, a small pigeon freed from a snare. It was a simple, quiet peace, a feeling he once thought lost forever. But that kind of peace is a fragile thing. Before the week was out, rumors started to travel. Whispers on the wind from local farmers and hunters. Tales of a poacher stalking the deep pine woods, setting cruel steel traps for any creature that crossed his path. Some claimed he was an outcast driven from another town. Others believed he was with a ring selling illegal animal pelts. No one knew his face, but they all knew his handiwork. Dark crimson staining the snow, tufts of fur caught in iron jaws. A sharp, sudden fear gripped Sarah. Her gaze shot to the two pups sleeping by the fire, their coats golden and black in the hearth's warm light. "I want them kept inside," she said, her voice strained with worry. "Not for a moment." Ethan gave a solemn nod. "They'll be safe. I'll keep a close watch." Ranger, the bigger of the two, was growing confident, his body stronger now, his bark taking on the deep tone of a protector. Scout, still smaller and more reserved, had found a quiet courage, all his own shadowing Tommy's every step with a gentle resolve. The boy adored him. Tommy's laughter had returned ringing out each time Scout would playfully tug his mitten or chase the falling snow. But this particular morning, that laughter was gone. Missing. Coming in from stacking wood, Ethan was struck by the silence. Tommy was just sitting by the window, his boots only half on, his face ashen. "He's gone," the boy whispered. A cold dread hit Ethan's gut. "Who's gone, Scout? He was right here after his breakfast. Then Ranger started barking, and when I looked out, he had just vanished." Sarah emerged from the back, already grabbing her coat. "He couldn't have gotten far." Her voice shook, betraying her composed expression. Ethan was already out the door. A fresh snow was falling, soft flakes that were already burying any tracks. But there, just at the wood line, a faint set of paw prints disappeared into the trees. "Stay here," Ethan commanded, yanking his gloves on tight. "I will bring him home." Tommy trailed him to the doorway. "Please," the boy pleaded softly. "He gets scared of loud sounds." Ethan gave a firm single nod. "We will find him." A sharp whistle and Ranger appeared, bounding from behind the cabin alert, and focused. They moved into the woods as one Ethan's pace, swift yet careful. The trail led them deeper into the pines, into a world of shadow and silence. The scent of rust and pine resin hung heavy, and the air a metallic bite that set his soldier's instincts on edge. Ranger froze. His ears pricked his entire body taut. Ethan dropped low beside him, his gaze sweeping the forest floor. And then he saw it. A spray of red on the white snow, brutal and stark. Scout's tracks stopped abruptly in a disturbed patch of snow, and next to it was an old iron trap, partially hidden, its metal teeth gleaming with fresh blood. "Damn it," Ethan whispered, moving forward. And there he was, shaking uncontrollably, one back leg crushed in the steel jaws. His small body was matted with blood, his eyes wild with shock and pain. Ethan fell to his knees beside him. "Easy, little guy," he murmured. "I'm gonna get you out." He moved his hands fumbling under the trap for the release. It was frozen shut, a single piece of rusted, stubborn steel. The cold sank its teeth into his skin, but he forced it, ignoring the sharp pain as metal sliced his palm. Scout cried softly, his tongue trying to soothe the wound, a silent plea for him to stop. "Not yet, buddy," Ethan grunted. "You just hold on for me." With a final desperate twist, the jaws broke free. Scout yelped and scrambled out, collapsing against Ethan's chest. His own blood stained his sleeve, a fact he didn't register. He tore his scarf in two, wrapping the pup's leg with the practiced, efficient motions of a field medic. The muscle memory from a different war flooded back. Clean the wound, tie it off, check for a pulse. Ranger's bark ripped through the silence. Ethan froze his eyes, scanning the trees. A figure moved through the gloom, a tall man in a drab hunting coat, a rifle resting on his shoulder. His beard was a tangled mess, his eyes hard slits beneath a worn cap. He looked like a man who lived by his own grim set of rules. The man's voice was like gravel. "That's my trap." Ethan rose, moving to shield Scout. "Not anymore." The poacher took a step forward, the snow groaning under his weight. "You don't want to get involved in this, stranger." Ethan's face was a stone mask. His breath was a slow, even cloud, his body shifting into a ready stance, the way a soldier instinctively measures a threat. "Too late." Ranger's growl was a low, simmering warning. The man raised his rifle just enough to be a promise. "Back off now." Ethan took one step toward him. "Put it down." The challenge hung there heavy in the frozen air. The poacher's jaw worked, his finger brushing the trigger. Ethan's pulse found the slow, steady rhythm of combat. The whole world narrowed down to his breath, his position, his next move. Then, a pulse of light cut through the woods, once, then twice. A signal. The red emergency lamp Sarah kept on the porch. She must have known something was wrong, that she'd called the sheriff. The poacher hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the distant glow. That single second of distraction was all Ethan needed. He lunged forward, his hand clamping onto the rifle barrel, twisting it hard. The gun fired its report, muffled by the snow. Ranger charged, a ferocious blur, driving the man backward until he tripped and went down hard. Moments later, the wail of sirens bled through the trees. 2 patrol trucks appeared, their headlights flooding the clearing blindingly bright. Deputies moved in, weapons raised. The poacher spit a curse but didn't resist. One of the cops, Deputy Harris, a burly man with tired eyes and graying hair, took the rifle and nodded at Ethan. "We've been hunting this guy for weeks. Appreciate the help." Ethan finally let out a breath. "Scout's hurt," was all he said. Harris knelt down, whistling softly. "Looks like you were too, son." Ethan glanced at his hand as if seeing it for the first time. The cut was deep, his blood a stark red against the snow. "I've had worse." He ripped a strip from his own shirt and wrapped it tight before carefully lifting Scout. "Let's get him home." By their return, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Sarah met them on the path, tears already welling in her eyes. "Oh God, Ethan." "He's all right," Ethan said softly. "Just a nasty cut and a new story." Back inside, Ethan cleaned and stitched the dog's wound himself, his hands unwavering as his own blood slowly seeped through his makeshift bandage. Fabric. Scout let out a low cry, but held still, lapping gently at Ethan's wrist. Sarah just watched, an unspoken pain stirring in her gaze. With the last stitch pulled, Ethan leaned back, dragging a hand across his brow. Ranger remained at his side, a silent sentinel, with his head on Ethan's boot. Sarah laid her hand over Ethan's bandaged one. "The fight's over, Ethan," she whispered. He met her eyes, and for the first time the torment was gone, replaced by a deep calm. Beyond the cabin, the woods held its breath, the shadows themselves in retreat. And then the storm arrived without a whisper. By dusk, the sky above Mill Creek had bruised to the color of ash as the first flakes began to fall, thick and heavy. By nightfall, the storm had become a living monster, a blinding white curtain devouring everything in its path. The power lines groaned, then snapped into darkness, plunging their small world into a sudden, suffocating silence pierced only by the wind's howl. Within the cabin's fragile walls, Ethan, Sarah, Tommy, and their 2 shepherds were drawn together by the fire. The only light was the desperate orange pulse from the hearth and the unsteady glow of a single lantern. Wind shrieked through the seams of the cabin, rattling the window panes in their frames. Ethan had braced what he was able, but the blizzard felt sentient, an ancient force testing the resolve of both man and timber. Sarah huddled near the stove, auburn hair a mess, her cheeks starkly red from the penetrating chill. She held Tommy tightly beneath a heavy quilt, her soft words a shield against the gale, as the boy held on to Scout, the younger of the 2 dogs. The animal's former timidity was gone, replaced by the sharp, quiet focus of a creature who understood survival all too well. Ethan knelt before the dying fire, carefully feeding it the last of their precious wood. His features worn by exhaustion and cold flickered in the dying light. "That's the last of it," he murmured. Sarah's head snapped up, fear carved into her expression. "The generator." He just shook his head. "The fuel's nearly dry. If this temperature keeps falling, we're going to need everything we have." Tommy peeked out from the blanket. "You can't go out there," the boy pleaded. "It's not safe." A faint smile touched Ethan's lips, but it never found its way to his eyes. "I've been through worse." He rose, pulling on his heavy coat, the scarred geography of his knuckles catching the firelight. "I'm just getting wood and fuel from the shed. It's close." Sarah was on her feet, her hand finding his arm. "Don't go by yourself." "Ranger's with me." He stated a simple fact. The powerful shepherd was instantly on his feet, his tail held low but unwavering. The fur on his back bristled as the wind hammered relentlessly against the door. Sarah paused, her hand still clutching his sleeve. "Please be careful," she whispered. He nodded once, meeting her gaze. "Always." The door groaned open, the sound alien in their small shelter as a blast of snow surged inside, stinging their skin. The fire guttered, nearly extinguished by the sudden white fury. Then the door slammed shut, and they were gone. 2 shadows instantly consumed by the blizzard. Outside vision was a luxury as snow drove down like icy needles against his exposed skin. His breath exploded in plumes of white vapor as he fought through knee-deep drifts, every single step an agonizing battle. Ranger forged ahead, body low to the ground, his powerful muscles working. His ears flattened against the howling wind. Ethan followed the ghost of the fence, letting it guide him toward the storage shed, standing stark at the property's edge. Once they reached it, Ethan's gloves were stiff as iron with ice. He forced the door open and seized what he could. A few pieces of firewood, a small can of fuel. The wind roared to life, shaking the very trees around them. "We gotta move," he yelled over the roar. They barely made it halfway back before the storm found a new fury. The air was filled with the sharp crack of breaking limbs. Somewhere in the distance, a great tree split apart with a sound just like thunder. Ranger barked his voice, utterly lost in the wind. Then Ethan heard it. The deep, mournful groan of a pine giving way, its roots tearing loose from the frozen ground. He whipped around, shouting, "Ranger down!" But it was already too late. The massive tree fell with a horrifying speed, crashing through the deep snow and striking the ground just beside them. Ethan dove aside, the wood splintering just inches from his leg. When the sound finally faded, all that he could hear was the wind and then a sharp, agonized yelp. "Ranger!" He scrambled through the snow, his flashlight beam cutting frantically through the darkness. The beam caught the edge of the shattered trunk, and then the sight that froze his very heart. Ranger was pinned beneath a heavy branch, struggling faintly, his hind leg horribly caught. The dog's chest heaved, steam rising with each breath. Ethan collapsed to his knees beside his friend. "Hang on, buddy. I've got you." He pushed against the branch, grunting muscles straining against the dead weight, but it wouldn't budge an inch. The snow was too deep, his footing giving way with every attempt. He tore off his gloves, his bare hands burning against the ice-crusted bark. Blood instantly appeared on his knuckles where the ice cut his skin. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on." Ranger whimpered, licking Ethan's wrist with what little strength he had. The man paused, chest heaving, his own strength nearly spent. The cold was everywhere now, seeping deep into his very bones. For a moment he simply pressed his forehead against the dog's fur, feeling the last of his life's heat, but it was fading. He closed his eyes. For the first time in so many years, the words rose up unbidden, born not of discipline, but of pure desperation. "If there's any miracle left at all in this world," he whispered into the heart of the storm, "take me instead, just save him." The wind roared back its answer, fierce and utterly hollow. Snow whipped around him like a living thing. Ethan stayed there motionless, his breath shallow the pain, in his leg completely forgotten. Then against his chest something stirred, a faint tremor beneath the palm of his hand. Ranger shifted, groaned, and with one last impossible surge of strength he pushed. The branch rolled aside just enough. Ethan reached down and pulled his friend free. Both man and dog collapsed together into the snow. Ranger's breathing was ragged, but his eyes were open. He licked Ethan's chin, a weak, grateful sound rumbling from his throat. Ethan laughed, a sound that was half a sob, half a prayer, and just wrapped his arms around his dog. The two of them sat there together in the storm, bleeding, freezing. But they were alive. When he finally looked up, the horizon itself had begun to change. The brutal wind had softened, and through thinning clouds came the very first faint streak of dawn, pale gold, spilling out through the endless white. The storm was breaking. He lifted Ranger carefully into his arms, stumbling toward the faint outline of the cabin in the distance. Each step was a fresh agony, but he would not stop. Behind him the forest groaned softly, as if sighing in relief. As they finally staggered onto the porch, the first light of dawn grazed the cabin windows, transforming frost into a sheet of shattered glass. The door burst open. Sarah stood there, a ghost with wide, terrified eyes. Tommy clung to Scout just behind her. "Oh my God!" Ethan's legs gave out. He crumpled to one knee inside the threshold, his grip on Ranger unbreakable. He's okay," he rasped. "We made it." The dog stirred his tail, managing a faint, exhausted thump on the floorboards. Sarah collapsed beside them, silent tears carving paths down her face. She pressed her palm to his frozen hand, her own lips trembling with the words. You found your miracle," she breathed. Ethan's gaze shifted from Ranger to the window, where morning light finally tore through the clouds. "No," he said, his voice fractured, his voice raw with emotion. "It found me. Beyond the cabin, the storm had finally surrendered, leaving only untouched, silent snow glittering beneath a newborn sun. The snow's retreat was slow that year, as if reluctant to let go. By mid-March, small rivulets began to run down from the hills, carving new veins through a forest that had been entombed in a silent white world. Pine branches heavy with melting snow wept with the thaw of new life. Spring arrived at Mill Creek, not in a flood, but as a slow surrender, the world awakening one single drop at a time. Outside that old cabin, sunlight flooded the yard where Ranger and Scout, now larger and brimming with life, wrestled in the damp grass. Ranger's dark coat shone in the sun, every muscle defined and sure, while the smaller, lighter Scout danced around him in a blur of joyous energy. Their barks echoed across the valley, a sound like pure laughter carried on the breeze. Ethan Cole leaned on the porch rail, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. His beard was thicker now, the silver in his temples catching the morning light. The scars across his knuckles had softened, less a memory of violence, and while the lines etched his face, they no longer seemed like the ravages of war. They were the map of a life that was finally being lived. From behind him, Sarah Jennings emerged, tying her auburn hair with a faded ribbon. The passing months had softened the sharp edges of her grief into a quiet, steady purpose. She wore a denim jacket over a cream sweater, her cheeks warm and flushed from the fire inside. "Those two are going to tear this whole yard to shreds before summer," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips, as she watched the dogs joyfully wrestle in the mud. Ethan let out a low chuckle, his voice still rough but now warm. "Let 'em. They've earned it." From inside, "The house!" Tommy's voice called out higher with excitement. "Mom, the sign is done!" He burst onto the porch holding a small wooden board, the fresh white and blue paint still gleaming. Its letters, uneven but heartfelt, were perfectly clear: Harbor Haven Shelter. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Tommy, it's perfect." Ethan knelt, taking the sign from him, holding it gently. The paint was still tacky, its scent sharp on the spring air, and beneath the name the boy had written in a careful, unsteady hand, "Where broken souls find a second chance." Ethan slowly looked up, his gaze meeting Sarah's. "That's one hell of a mission statement," he said softly. She simply smiled. "It's the one you gave to us." In the weeks that followed, the small property was reborn. The cabin that once held only a father's memory became a sanctuary for strays and rescues. The old barn was mended, filled with warm stalls and clean blankets. The weathered shed became a small clinic stocked with Sarah's medical supplies, and a new fence enclosed the field where Ranger and Scout patrolled their days like two proud, watchful guardians. Word traveled fast through Mill Creek, whispers of the family taking in strays, and of the haunted Navy SEAL who had once walked into a blizzard to pull two dying puppies from the brink. By late April, the first broken souls arrived. A farmer brought a shepherd limping and lost from the hills. A young woman appeared with a kitten found half frozen beneath her porch. Ethan mended fences, and built shelters. Tommy fed and brushed their fur, while Sarah tended to their wounds with a surgeon's steady hands. The cadence of their days became a quiet anthem of healing, saving one small life at a time. Then one morning, as Sarah cleaned the new clinic and Tommy made his rounds with the dogs, a truck rumbled up the drive, its tires spitting gravel. Ethan emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. The man who climbed out was a wall of a man, broad-shouldered with a thick brown beard streaked with gray, and a navy tattoo faded and blurred on his wrist. He wore a worn leather jacket and the heavy air of a man who'd seen too much of the world and said far too little. "Cole," the man grunted, a grin hiding in the beard. "Damn it, really is you." Ethan froze. Then a short, ragged laugh escaped him. "Henderson." "Still kicking somehow," Henderson replied, clapping a heavy hand on his friend's shoulder. "Saw your story in the paper. Former SEAL rescues pups in a Maine blizzard. Figured you'd gone soft, brother." Ethan smirked. "You drove all this way, just to tell me that—" "Mostly," Henderson admitted, his eyes drifting to the field where Ranger and Scout were wrestling. "But I had to see it for myself. They're the real heroes of this story, aren't they?" Ethan's smirk melted into something softer, more fragile. "Yeah," he breathed. "They pulled me back when I didn't think there was anything left to pull back." Henderson nodded, his own gaze lost for a moment. "You were always better at saving everyone else but yourself." They shared a low laugh, the kind born from a history that words could never touch. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, then wiping her hands on her apron. The hardness in Henderson's eyes vanished. "So, this is the woman who finally anchored you down." Sarah felt a faint blush rise, but she smiled. "Someone had to stop him from trying to fix the roof with duct tape again." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Hey, it worked, didn't it?" Just then, Tommy appeared with Ranger loping at his heels. "Mom Ranger wants to play fetch," he announced, holding a stick far too big for him. He stopped dead when he saw the stranger. "Who's that?" "An old friend," Ethan said, placing a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. Tommy sized up the man, then looked back at Ethan. "You have friends?" The three adults erupted in laughter. Henderson grinned. "Smart kid you got here." As the afternoon bled into evening, they traded stories of old wars, of ghosts left behind, and the disquieting peace of coming home. Henderson stayed for dinner, and as the fire burned low, he leaned back, watching Ethan in the flickering light. "You found your peace, didn't you?" Ethan's gaze swept over the faces around him. Sarah's gentle smile, Tommy's sleepy laughter, the dogs breathing softly by the hearth. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "I wasn't even aware I was searching." Henderson nodded, his eyes shining in the dark. "Always were a stubborn son of a gun." He stood pulling on his jacket. "Don't be a stranger, brother, and keep saving the world one four-legged soldier at a time." After the truck's taillights vanished down the long road, the night fell silent once more. Ethan stepped onto the porch. The air was rich with the smell of rain and pine and the stars, faint above the fading clouds. Ranger moved in, pressing his head into Ethan's leg. Scout followed his tail, wagging gently. Inside, Sarah was tucking Tommy into bed. The boy yawned, eyelids heavy. "Mom," he breathed out. "Can I call Ethan, Dad?" Sarah stilled for a second, her heart seizing. "You can if you want, sweetheart." Tommy smiled, his voice fading as he slept. "Good night, Dad." Ethan, just outside the door, heard every bit. The word hit him like a physical blow. So simple, so small, yet it held more weight than all his burdens of war. He leaned on the doorway, eyes shimmering, a smile breaking the silence. By morning, the meadow was teeming with color. The melted snow had yielded to wildflowers, brilliant yellow, white, and deep violet. Ranger and Scout raced through the grass, their joyful barks echoing off the hills. Ethan stood with Sarah by the fence, their hands finding one another with ease. The wind felt cool, carrying the smell of spring and cedar. And before them, the sign Tommy made hung proudly on the main gate. Harbor Haven Shelter, where broken souls find a new start. Sarah looked right at him, her voice so soft. "Do you really think that's true?" Ethan squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on the dogs racing towards the horizon. "I know it is." And as the sun slipped behind the pines, it painted the valley. In gold, it was impossible to know where salvation stopped and home began. Sometimes miracles don't arrive in flashes of light or with an angel's voice. They arrive quietly through a warm hand, the devotion of a dog, or the courage to begin again when all seems lost. God doesn't always move the mountains we face. Sometimes He provides the strength to climb them one step at a time beside the ones who refuse to give up on us. Ethan, Sarah, and Tommy discovered their redemption not in some grand victory, but in the quiet grace of a love reborn and hearts that were finally mended by faith. And perhaps that is the same miracle awaiting us every day. The unseen kindness that keeps us standing. The silent prayers that still reach heaven when our voices tremble. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances really do exist. Leave your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories of faith and unending hope. And may God bless you and your family with the light in every storm. Amen.